Today we're in Acts 26, verses 22 to 32, and Paul is finishing up now his fifth defense speech in Acts. This started back in chapter 22. His first defense was before the Jewish mob. His second defense in chapter 23 was before the Sanhedrin Council, and then in chapter 24 it was before Felix. Then in chapter 25, it was before Festus, and now in chapter 26, Festus is still here, but mainly his defense here is before King Agrippa II. And remember, he has just explained that the reason he is in prison is because the Jews hate the fact that he's teaching Gentiles that they can be saved without becoming Jews. And this was really smart on Paul's part because many of the audience members would have been Gentiles. Festus was a Gentile. There would have been other, city officials there who would have also been Gentiles. And Paul's saying, look, I'm trying to help Gentiles. I'm trying to teach Gentiles the truth and to bring light to them and to bring them to God in repentance. But the Jews are stopping me from doing that. Now that also would have tugged on the heartstrings of Herod Agrippa II as well, because Herod Agrippa, and I didn't mention this before, I should have, he's a half Jew. Okay, he's an Edomite, so he descends from Esau. So he's sort of half Esau, half Jacob. He's in the Harry Potter world, they'd call him a mudblood. It's when a wizard marries a muggle or a common person. And what happened was his great-grandfather, Herod the Great, he was an Idumean, he's an Edomite, and the problem is that called his Jewishness into question. And that's a problem because he's supposed to be a king of the Jews. He's supposed to be ruling over Jews. But the Jews were looking at Herod the Great saying, well, you're an Idumean though. You're not really one of us fully. It's kind of like, again, in Harry Potter, the mudbloods, they weren't considered legitimate wizards because their blood had been intermingled and poisoned or whatever. Well, what happened was Herod the Great, because he was an Idumean, he married into a Jewish family, hoping that alliance, that marriage would sort of purify his lineage and make them considered more legitimate as Jews. But again, the Jews still didn't really take that seriously. They just viewed him as mixed blood because he's a Gentile who married into, a Jewish family, but not really fully Jewish. And so Herod Agrippa II, he would have familiarity with the Jewish customs, the law and the prophets because he's a Jew, but also sympathy toward the Gentiles. So when Paul says, the Jews are trying to stop me from reaching Gentiles, okay, that would also sort of influence Herod as well, making the Jews here out to be the bad guys and not Paul. Well, Paul continues in verse 22, and he sort of summarizes his defense by saying, having obtained help from God, okay, when I preach here, both the small and great, but I stand before you, saying nothing more than the law and the prophets said. Okay, so Paul, I love it's kind of an understatement when he says, I've obtained help from God. I mean, just think about all the help Paul has received on all three of his missionary journeys. And then when he comes to Jerusalem, now he's being persecuted more. He's stoned to death in Lystra. He's chased around from town to town, persecuted in so many ways. And he says, you know what? God has been my help. And it's because he has helped me and shown me favor. And maybe this sort of legitimizes Paul as well. The fact that he's survived this long, okay, might show that he's actually on God's side. God is still with him, still protecting him, not just giving him safety, but giving him wisdom through the Holy Spirit. And he says, look, all I'm doing is telling everybody what the Old Testament said was going to happen, that there was going to be a Christ, verse 23, who was going to suffer and rise from the dead and become a light to the Gentiles. Now, he's referring back to the book of Isaiah. And it's kind of cool how the verses match up, but in Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:6, they're both passages about how God's going to raise up a servant who would become a light to the Gentiles. And in that original context, the servant was supposed to be Israel. The Jews were supposed to be the light to the Gentiles, but unfortunately, because of their sin and their disobedience, they actually became cause for God's name to be blasphemed among the Gentiles. So they totally failed. And so God says, I'm going to raise up a servant of my own who will then become a light. And that servant also is mentioned in Isaiah 53 to be a suffering servant. Okay, that's talking about Jesus, obviously. Jesus was the suffering servant who was going to come and open the eyes of the Gentiles who are trapped in darkness. And this is really cool too, because earlier in Paul's defense, He said Jesus appointed him to be a light to the Gentiles. Back in verses 17 and 18, Jesus said, I'm sending you to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light. And so Paul actually is carrying on the work of Jesus to be a light to the Gentiles. Even though Jesus isn't there anymore, he's ascended up to heaven, his work on earth continues through the apostles like Paul, who are now the new servants of God to bring light into the world, continuing to be a servant like Christ. So it gives Luke another opportunity to show us a connection between Paul and Jesus and how Jesus' work is still continuing on the earth. Well, Festus, after hearing this defense speech, you got to remember a couple things about Festus. First of all, he's a Roman, and so any word about a resurrection from the dead is insanity to a Roman. Okay, to Greeks and Romans, because they did not believe in the resurrection of our body. They believed that our spirit would live on after our death, but a bodily resurrection was just crazy to them. So you can see why Festus would call Paul mad, and your learning has driven you crazy, Paul. But secondly, remember, Festus, he's not a Jew, so he would not understand the law and the prophets. So he would not get the point that Paul's trying to make, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and prophets. That would just go right over his head. And so that's another reason why he would look at Paul and say, you're just talking crazy here. I don't even know what you're saying at this point. And then maybe another factor here is Paul's enthusiasm. You know Paul, he's going to be very passionate as he's presenting this. And so when Festus sees, that Paul is so passionate about things that to him are absolute nonsense, he just says, you're a crazy person. And you can understand from his position, if you put yourself in Festus' shoes, why he would think that about Paul. And, sometimes it's like that for us too. Our friends and our family members, when we become Christians and we're just on fire for Jesus, it's confusing to them. They think we've gone crazy. And maybe if you're younger, right, your parents think, oh, you're just going through a phase, right? Because here's this person, and they're so passionate about a dead guy, right? About a criminal who was crucified, 2,000 years ago. Why in the world would you have any passion for that? And people might think that we're crazy. But we can assure them, just like Paul assures Festus, no, we are speaking words of sober truth. We are being completely reasonable. There's nothing more reasonable than to believe in the resurrection and Jesus' fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures, in his death, in his suffering, in his victorious exaltation in the end. So here's the thing. Paul, though, he understands that Festus is confused. He gets why Festus is confused. But he knows that Herod is not confused at all. He knows that Herod knows the law and the prophets, okay? And that Herod has heard all about Jesus and his death and his resurrection. Not just that, but also his ministry of miracles for 3 years. Herod has been around for quite some time, okay? Festus is new to the scene. He just arrived in town, okay? He's new to Palestine, okay? But Agrippa is not new to Palestine, and he's a Jew. So, he's making trips down to the temple. He's in charge of the temple affairs. He would have absolutely heard about Jesus and his miracles and his teachings and the death and the resurrection and about the church spreading and all of that. And I love how Paul says none of this was done in a corner. If you want to create a hoax, that's something you want to do in secret. You want to keep a hoax small, among a small group of people, so that maybe a rumor gets started that's sort of unverifiable. Okay, but Paul says, no, this hasn't been done in a corner. Everything about Christianity has been totally public, totally out in the open, and he knows, Herod knows, and so he looks at Herod. And it's incredible. He says to him, do you, Herod, believe the prophets? I know that you do. And that's just amazing, because Paul is the one who's supposed to be on trial here, and yet he turns this around and he puts King Agrippa on trial. And this is a really hard spot for Agrippa, because he can't deny the law and the prophets, okay, because he's a Jew and, he wants to stay on the Jews' good side, and he sort of knows that what Paul is saying is true. But he doesn't want to become a Christian, okay, potentially, depending on how we take the next verse, which there's a whole lot of different ways to take that. But there is no record that he actually became a Christian. So he's sort of in a tight spot where, he doesn't want to deny the law and the prophets, but he also knows he doesn't want to become a Christian, and he also knows that Paul's innocent. So he just says in verse 28, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. Now that verse, super hard to translate. We have no idea how to properly translate that verse, and that's why all of your Bible translations render it differently. Okay, the New King James makes it sound very hopeful, and he says, you've almost persuaded me, almost like, hey, I'm about to get baptized if you just keep going. New American Standard, it sort of is matter of fact, like in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. Like, if you keep talking, Paul, the more I hear from you, I probably will become a Christian. But then there are some translations that translate it as a question. Like, do you really think you're going to make me a Christian? You're going to convert me in such a short time and in such few words? Okay, so there's different ways to take it, and we honestly don't know how to take this verse because we don't know his tone of voice. Was it sincere? Was it sarcastic? Was it a statement? Was it a question? We're just not sure. But we are sure what Paul says in verse 29 is, look, my goal is for everybody to become a Christian. Okay, that everybody standing here, not just you, but Festus and everybody else here at this meeting, I want them to become Christians. I want everybody to become like me, except for these chains, right? So maybe he's holding the chains up and he's saying, well, I don't want you to actually be a prisoner, okay, but I do want you to come to Jesus. And there's a great irony that Paul is the one in chains, literally, okay, but spiritually, he's the only free person there at this meeting. And Paul's goal is that he would set them free, right? It seems like Paul is waiting for them to deliver him from prison, right? Because they're the judge, they're the ones sort of hearing his case, and they have the power to determine whether to set him free or not. But Paul knows in his heart, I'm already free. Jesus is the one who set me free. The truth will set you free, Jesus said. You all are the ones who are still in prison, who are enchained to Satan in the dominion of darkness, he said. Okay, this may also be why Festus got so mad earlier, because he insinuated that the Gentiles are in darkness and that they need light. That may have been offensive, right, to Festus, maybe to some others. Okay, but this is the reality on the ground. Paul is the one in the light. Everybody else is in darkness. Paul is the one who's free. Everybody else is in chains. He has the power to deliver them if they'll just hear the gospel. And that is why Paul makes the gospel his focus of his trial. It's not about him and defending his own honor and dignity. It's mainly about Jesus Christ. I want everybody to become a Christian. And they recognize, verse 30 and 31, this man has done nothing wrong. Okay, we cannot, accuse him of anything worthy of imprisonment or death. And this is Luke's 5th time that he gets to tell us Paul is innocent. It's great. He's had 5 defense speeches. This is the 5th and final time Paul is declared innocent. Again, Christianity is not anti-Rome. Christianity is not anti-Judaism. And Herod says, hey, he might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now, I used to read that and think, oh, Paul, man, you messed up. You should not have appealed to Caesar. Then you could have gone free. But remember, it's Jesus' will for Paul to go to Rome. So it's actually a good thing that he appealed to Caesar. Because here's the thing. Let's say he did not appeal to Caesar and King Herod Agrippa let him go free. He might not have made it to Rome, because there's a lot of people that want Paul dead right now. The Jews want Paul dead. They may not even let him get as far as Rome. But because he has appealed to Caesar, now he gets a free escort by Roman guards to Rome so that he will be kept safe on this journey. It's just a beautiful instance, again, of Jesus' providence, keeping Paul safe so that he could fulfill his promises to Paul to bring him to Rome. Now, let me just say this by way of application at the end. Many times, we're going to be attacked for our faith in the gospel, and it's going to feel like we are on trial. But you have to understand, anytime anybody puts the gospel on trial, puts Jesus or one of his followers on trial, they're actually putting themselves on trial. It's their heart that is being exposed as they try to cast blame on an innocent person like Jesus. And they show that they don't care about the evidence for Jesus that has just been so publicly known and preserved for us through Scripture and through eyewitness testimony. This person, when they attack Jesus, they are exposing the fact that they are against God and they don't have a heart that is honestly seeking, and they don't have a mind that's actually open to evidence and to seeking truth. And so That's what we need to do when we're in that spot, is turn it around on them and get them to explain and put them on the defensive for why they would be attacking Jesus and the gospel, just like Paul does here with Herod. He says, I know that you know the truth of what I'm saying. And I know there are some people that they're still not going to care, right? They're still not going to become Christians. Again, no evidence really that Herod Agrippa became a Christian, but we just need to remember the gospel is never really on trial. The ones that are on trial are the ones putting the gospel on trial. And if they don't repent and they don't obey the gospel, then when they stand trial before God on the final day of judgment, God will bring down justice upon them for it. So don't be afraid in that situation, feeling like you're in the weak spot because you're under attack. You're the one on trial and you feel like, you're the one in the vulnerable position. You're not. You're in the strong position. They are in the vulnerable position because the truth exposes everything about where they are. And if we'll just stick with the truth and be bold like Paul and stand up for Jesus in those moments, we can win souls for Jesus. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in Acts 27, verses 1 through 12, and this is the longest we section in the book of Acts. It starts with we in verse 1 because Luke is now with Paul again. He hasn't been with Paul, presumably, for the last couple of years while Paul was in prison in Caesarea. Perhaps Luke was traveling around, sort of gaining information and eyewitness testimony so that he could put his Gospel of Luke together and help him, maybe even compile the book of Acts as well. But now he's back with Paul, and he's going to go on this treacherous journey by the sea. And he is so detailed. All of the nautical details about sailing and about the wind and the kind of ships that they're on and the peril that they experience. It's really unparalleled in ancient literature to have so much detail, but it serves to authenticate this document, that this really happened. Luke knows exactly what he's talking about because he was there. Now, many people also wonder, why does he spend so much time recording this journey? This is a really long chapter, and again, it's very detailed in how he sort of maps out this trip. Well, let me suggest to you that Luke is again showing a parallel between Jesus and Paul, between Jesus' work and Paul's work. And actually, it's a connection with the Gospel of Luke. So remember, the Gospel of Luke is volume 1. The book of Acts is volume 2. So in volume 1, Luke's focus is on Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And at the end of Luke, Jesus has come to Jerusalem to accomplish his mission, of dying, of resurrecting, sort of bringing his teachings and his life and resurrection to Jerusalem, which was the heart of the Jewish empire, if you will. I understand the Jews didn't really have an empire in the technical sense, but you understand metaphorically, Jerusalem was the heart of Judaism. It's the heart of the Jewish empire. Whereas in the book of Acts, Luke has been focusing on Paul's movement toward Rome. So Paul then goes from Jerusalem to Rome at the end of Acts. So it's like Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem, and then Paul goes from Jerusalem to Rome. Now, obviously, he had all those other missionary journeys and everything, but Luke really, I think, slows down at the end to create this tension and to show this movement in great detail of Paul from Jerusalem to Rome, because Rome is the heart of the Gentile empire. So Luke finishes with Jesus in the heart of the Jewish empire, and Acts finishes with Paul in the heart of the Gentile empire. Because if the gospel can go to Rome, Rome is the heart of the world at that time. It was viewed as the center of the world. All roads lead to Rome, right? It was the center of all travel and communication and culture. And so if the gospel can infiltrate Rome and convert people in Rome, well, then it can, from that point, radiate out to the rest of the known world. So this is such an important moment for Luke to develop. Now, here's something else that I think is very awesome. Just like Jesus, when he went to Jerusalem, the heart of the Jewish empire, he faced death in this incredibly hopeless situation. And yet God delivered him and rescued him from death in the resurrection. So too Paul, on this journey, is going out into the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. And if you understand ancient culture, you know that to the Jews and to the Gentiles, the sea represented death. Okay, that is why sometimes the realm of the dead, Sheol or Hades, was referred to as the abyss, right? The depths of the sea was a representation of death. The sea itself represented chaos, okay, and darkness and just utter helplessness because you were at the mercy of the sea. And now you see Paul going on this very dangerous, very perilous journey to the point where it looks like he's going to die. And they're in a situation where there is no hope at all. In fact, later in this chapter, you'll see in verse 20, he says at the end of verse 20, "From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned." Okay? And yet, God is with Paul, just like he was with Jesus. And Jesus is with Paul because Paul is continuing Jesus' work of bringing the gospel, into Rome. And so Jesus delivers Paul, which vindicates Paul. This is another act of God vindicating Paul and showing that Paul is perfectly innocent, just like Jesus' resurrection vindicated him. Even though Jesus was accused of being a criminal and he was put to death right alongside two criminals, two thieves, he was numbered with the transgressors. God vindicates Jesus by raising him from the dead and showing, no, he was innocent. Likewise here, Paul has been falsely accused, of being a criminal, falsely put on trial, and now he's on a ship full of other criminals. There are other legit prisoners on this ship with him to Rome, presumably being shipped to Rome so that they'll be punished there in Rome, maybe forced to compete in the gladiatorial games and ripped to shreds by animals and all of that. And now Paul too is numbered with the transgressors. He's on a ship full of criminals. And yet God vindicates Paul because he does not allow the sea of death to swallow Paul up. He brings Paul safely out the other side. Sorry to spoil the chapter, but Paul is going to be preserved and saved. And one of the main themes in this chapter to look for is the theme of salvation. Over and over again, it talks about salvation. It talks about being saved. Paul is the one presented as the new Jesus, who is the source of salvation to anybody who is willing to listen to his instructions. And already we're going to see in today's reading, they don't listen to Paul and they put themselves in terrible jeopardy because of it. All right, so let's now, with that background in mind, hopefully that is just really enriching to you. And I think this chapter also comes to life when you just see it on a map and you understand the winds and the currents and the time of year that this is. It will really come to life for you. So I'm going to have the map up for most of the rest of this video so that you can see what they're doing on this ship. Okay, so first of all, verse 1, it was decided that we would sail for Italy, so they proceeded to deliver Paul and some of other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. We don't really know exactly what Julius's role is. I mean, he's a centurion. He's a man above 100 soldiers, right? 100 soldiers are under a centurion. But because he's part of the Augustan cohort, and a cohort was made up of like between 600 to 1,000 soldiers, perhaps he served some special role to Augustus Caesar, to the emperor. Maybe he's part of the emperor's bodyguard. Maybe he was sent on a special mission by the emperor. Some think maybe he was the one that escorted Festus down to Caesarea to replace the governor Felix. And now he's on his way back to Rome. We're not 100% sure, but now he's in the presence of a centurion, just like Jesus, by the way, at his death is surrounded by centurions. Okay, here's Julius, a centurion, and they embark on an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia. Now, if you look on the map, if you look up at Asia, just on this particular map, if you can find the word Asia and just go to your left, go to the west, you'll see the town of Adramyttium, and that was a major shipbuilding town. And they would build these ships that they would use then for trade and for commerce. And those ships would sail down the western coast of Asia and then around the southern coast of Asia Minor and on down toward Palestine, or toward Caesarea where they're taking off from. And so probably Caesarea is like the southernmost tip of that ship's journey, and now they're hopping on that ship, and they're going to take that ship on up as far north as they can go, which eventually will take them to Myra. But they sail along the coast of Asia, and they put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus. This is one of Paul's companions, and he'll show up later in some of his letters like Colossians and Philemon. Remember, Paul is in good standing, and he's able to have help from his friends. So Luke is traveling with him, Aristarchus is traveling with him. And it's important to understand, right now, if you look on a map, the winds at this time are coming from the west and from the northwest. And so you really can't just sail out into the open sea. I mean, they can't take a straight course from Caesarea to Rome. That's not going to work. They have to travel around the coast, the southern coast of Asia, so that landmass will block the wind. And the other cool thing is the currents at this time. We're traveling, if you look at the currents underneath Asia Minor, okay, the currents move from east to west. So not only could they avoid the wind by traveling under Asia Minor, they could also travel with the currents along that journey to get to Myra. So that's where they're headed. And it says the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius, again, he treats Paul with consideration because, yes, he's numbered with the transgressors, but he notices there's something different about this man. It's kind of like the centurion when Jesus dies. He recognizes truly this man was the Son of God. There's something different about this guy than these other two criminals that were crucified with him. There's something different about Paul. He's actually innocent. The Romans are actually treating him well. And even when they come to Sidon, Paul is allowed to have his friends come and comfort him, maybe bring him clothing, maybe bring him food for the journey, maybe pray with him and encourage him. From there, verse 4, we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So notice, they cannot travel underneath the island of Cyprus. That's not going to work because then they're traveling directly into those winds that are coming from the west and the northwest. So they actually have to travel around the eastern side of the island of Cyprus so that it will block those winds and allow them to actually travel further north. And when we had sailed, verse 5, through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, that's Asia Minor there, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us aboard it. Now, if you look on the map there, find Egypt. You'll see that Alexandria is a city in Egypt. And they would very commonly send grain from Alexandria to Rome. Okay, Rome imported tons and tons of grain from Egypt. Egypt was like the breadbasket of Rome. And so at the same time, at this point, the Alexandrian ship can't travel straight to Rome because the winds are too contrary. So it has to go up north first. And so it goes to Myra, and that's where they change ships. Now, let me just show you a picture, first of all, of an Adramyttian ship. This is a model that can be found in modern day in the Malta Maritime Museum on the island of Malta, which we'll talk about in the coming days. Paul will arrive on Malta. But here you see this ship with two oars in the back and a rudder on the back, and then a main sail right in the middle, and then a foresail up front. And here's sort of an artistic rendering of that ship. Now, when they changed to an Alexandrian ship, I really couldn't find that there's a whole lot of difference between these ships. It's just probably part of the issue was the Adramyttian ship wasn't going to Rome. The Adramyttian ship was going back up to Adramyttium, right? It was going to continue up the western coast of Asia, back where it came from. So they needed to hop a different ride, and now they're on an Alexandrian ship. Now, these ships could be huge. They could be 180 feet long. So think about an 18-story building, turn it on its side. This is a massive ship. It could hold tons of cargo, thousands and thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of cargo on these ships. And we'll learn later in verse 37 there are 276 people traveling on this ship. And it was very common for people to hop on board of grain ships and use them for travel. So this is not unusual at all. Verse 7, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off of Cnidus, if that's how you say it, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. So you can just see that when they leave Myra and now they're heading west, they're losing cover. Okay, they're coming back out into the open of those winds. So as they sail toward Cnidus, or Cnidus if the C is silent, you see they can't really make it to Cnidus because the winds are going to prevent it. So now they have to turn southward, and they've got to go along the eastern side of the island of Crete, again to block the wind, and with difficulty sailing past it. Now, verse 8, it's difficult at that point because they probably had no wind, right? The island of Crete is just blocking the wind completely, and so now they're just maybe dealing with whatever land breeze they can. So it's a difficult journey to Fair Havens, which is a bay at on the southern side of the island of Crete, which is near the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed, the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, and Paul began to admonish them. So you got to understand, they are sailing at a dangerous time right now. The fast is a reference to the Day of Atonement. This is the year AD 59, so the Day of Atonement was around October 5th of that year. The time that's the danger zone for sailing is September 14th to November 11th. You do not want to sail at that time. It's pretty dangerous, okay? But then November 11th on, all the way to March 10th, that's just, you don't sail at all. That's the winter time. The weather is too crazy. It's a suicide mission. You just don't sail. You got to find somewhere to winter. And that's what they're looking for now. Now they're realizing, hey, we're already sort of pushing it. It's already the danger zone because it's October. Hey, but soon we're not going to be able to sail at all, so we've got to find somewhere to put our ship into harbor and to sort of hunker down and to stay safe for the winter. And Paul was trying to tell them, we need to just stay here. He's saying this is too dangerous to leave Fair Havens. Okay, we just need to hang out here. Otherwise, we might lose our ship. We might lose our cargo. We might lose our very own lives. But they didn't listen to him. Instead, they listened to the pilot and the captain of the ship. And actually, the word captain there means owner. So it's probably the owner, the guy who owns that grain ship and actually makes money from that grain ship. And of course, the centurion, he's in charge, but he's listening to the pilot of the ship, okay, and the owner as knowing more than Paul does. But remember, Paul has some experience. When he wrote 2 Corinthians 11 a while back, okay, he said he had already been shipwrecked 3 times. So Paul knows what it's like to make the wrong moves nautically from a ship, and he's trying to warn them, don't make this mistake. But they don't listen to him, and they don't think that it's suitable to winter there. And so the majority, they sort of maybe took a vote or whatever, and they make a decision from there, and they're hoping they can reach Phoenix, which is on the very west side of Crete. And we're going to learn in tomorrow's reading that didn't go well for them. So I hope you already see, when you see this on a map, when you understand the time of the year and the danger zone, and you understand Luke's purpose in this chapter, it just becomes such an awesome chapter. It only gets better. It's such a great story, and it's history, right? It actually happened. It's so exciting to see the peril that Paul faces, and yet Jesus' provision through it. Let me make this quick application. I know I've gone long today. Just so excited to introduce this chapter to you. Sometimes the apostles are going to disagree with the quote-unquote experts, and we need to listen to the apostles instead. Okay? Sometimes Scripture is going to say things that, the experts of our day disagree with, the common wisdom of our day disagree with. And we need to always give more weight to what the apostles are saying here, instead of listening to Paul the apostle for salvation. Okay, and that's going to be a theme all throughout this chapter. They're listening to the experts. They're listening to the pilot of the ship. They're listening to the owner of the ship. And they're just totally disregarding. I mean, this is a Jewish rabbi. Like, what does he know in their minds? But Paul knows what he's talking about. And because they didn't listen to him, they almost all died. They almost all were not saved, because salvation comes from listening to God's apostles. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 27, verses 13 to 20, and remember, they did not listen to Paul. Paul's idea was to stay right there in Fair Havens, which is a bay at the southern portion of the island of Crete. And they did not listen to him, maybe because they figured, well, Fair Havens, it's a little bit exposed to the wind in different directions, so it may not be the best place to put in for winter. Remember, they've only got about 3 weeks left of sailing, and they're already in the danger zone. They should not be sailing at all right now, but they've got 3 weeks left until it's no sail time. Past November 11th, you just can't be out on the water. You've got to be putting in at harbor. You've got to be staying somewhere for the winter, and they disagree with Paul's idea, and they say, no, we think we can make it over to Phoenix, which is going to be about 35 miles west of where they are. And there's a little bit of a hope, actually, in verse 13 that it might work, because in verse 13, it says, when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So the wind shifted on them a little bit. Now there's a wind coming from the south, and they think, hey, we can use this wind to help get us there to Phoenix. So they weighed anchor, which means they lifted up the anchor, and they began sailing. Now, interestingly, when it says, supposing they had attained their purpose, it's almost like the ancient equivalent of saying, we're as good as there. We can do this. We've got this. It's like we're already at Phoenix because we've got this awesome south wind that has come up, and normally that might work, but unfortunately they didn't count on Euraquilo, and this is sort of the nickname given to the northeasterly winds that come from the direction of the northeast, and they're blowing southwest because Crete had mountains that were 7,000 feet tall, and the cold air from the mountains many times would come down and mix with the warm water of the sea and create this violent storm, this sort of cyclone effect, where now the ship is really, they thought they were going to go to Phoenix, but the northeasterly winds are pushing on the ship too hard. They can't go that direction anymore, so they decide, verse 15, when the ship was caught in it, they couldn't face the wind anymore. We gave way to it, and we let ourselves be driven along, and we went under the shelter of a small island called Clauda. Sometimes it's translated on maps as Cauda, but they're in a storm now. I mean, this cyclone is violently tossing their ship, and there's also a little boat, like a dinghy, like a lifeboat, that they would have been carrying behind them, towing that ship behind the larger ship. And so they try to pull this smaller boat back up onto the big ship. And it's really hard to do because that boat probably by this time is filled with water from this violent cyclone, from this violent storm. And, there's rain going on. And so they're having a hard time pulling that smaller boat up onto the larger ship. But they finally hoisted it up, verse 17, and then they realized, look, the ship is cracking, from all of the wind and the battering by the waves and the sea and the rain and all that. And so they realized, we've got to tie cables around the hull of the ship. And there's some debate over whether they would have tied those cables horizontally around the hull or vertically down, sort of the length of the ship. Are they tying up the width of the ship? Are they tying up the length of the ship? I'm not 100% sure, but the idea is they're tying the ship together so it doesn't break apart in the storm. Especially because, remember, that center mast in the center of the ship, when the storm caught a hold of that, it was attached to this giant beam, and if the wind started blowing on that giant beam, it could really crack the hull. And so they've got this thing tied up. It's interesting, Luke, he's a doctor, and so when he talks about supporting cables, he means it's like a medical term, helping cables or bandaging cables. So they're bandaging up the ship from Luke's perspective as a doctor. And they're also afraid now that they're going to run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. So you can kind of see on a map, I'll put up a different map here, how you can see two gulfs. One gulf, and this is at the northern tip of Africa. One gulf is called the Lesser Syrtis. The other is the Greater Syrtis. Sometimes it's called Syrtis Minor and Syrtis Major. But about 100 miles off the coast of Africa, above the Greater Syrtis, were these shifting sandbars, and they were the absolute terror and dread of Mediterranean sailors. They were terrified of running the ship aground onto one of those sandbars, because what could happen is, once your ship runs aground on that sandbar, it gets stuck in the sandbar, and then if the waves are battering your ship, okay, there's no give in the ship anymore, right? Your ship is stuck. So the ship is going to take on the full force of the winds and the waves, and it would just decimate your ship. It would just crush your ship into a million tiny little wooden pieces. And so that was the last thing they wanted, was to run aground on one of these Syrtis sandbars. And so it says they let down the sea anchor. The literal translation is gear there. So we don't know exactly what they did. New American Standard says they anchor, almost like they're trying to weigh down the ship so it'll go slower, so it won't, run aground so quickly on the sandbar. Maybe that's what it means. Other translations just say gear. Others say they struck sail. So maybe the idea is they took down that center mast. And now, instead of having the center mast up, catching all this wind from the storm, maybe they just have that smaller foresail up front to catch a little bit of the wind so that they can keep moving. But you just see how disastrous this is. And they're trying to strengthen the ship against this storm to keep themselves alive. And now they're just sort of being driven along however the wind wants to drive them. I mean, there's just wind going in all sorts of directions at this point. And now they're to the point, verse 18, of saying they're violently storm-tossed. And now they start to jettison the cargo. The ship is too heavy. It's probably still leaking, even with those cables. And you can imagine maybe they're, underneath the deck, and they're just being tossed back and forth. Maybe some of them are still up on the deck trying to monitor the situation. Okay, but this is just a horrendously scary scenario. And now they're throwing cargo overboard. Maybe some of the luggage of the passengers that are there. Maybe some of the food supply they're getting rid of. This would have been really sad for the owner of the ship, right? Because this is his money. This is what, he set out from Alexandria with all this grain and all these goods for trade and commerce. And now they've got to get rid of it because the ship is probably taking on water. It's heavy, it's leaking. And so if they can take some of the weight off the ship can then be lifted up to sit higher on top of the water and not be so, affected by leaks. And so verse 19, on the third day, they started throwing the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Again, not 100% sure what tackle it's talking about there. Maybe just some, random tools and equipment that they would use maybe for ship repairs or whatever. Like they're just whatever it takes, right? We're lightening the load on this ship. And, it's kind of interesting because this story has a Jonah kind of a feel to it. But Paul is really the anti-Jonah. Because in Jonah, remember, he was on the ship because he was avoiding doing God's will. He did not want to go and preach to the Ninevites, so he went down to Tarshish to run away from the Lord and to avoid doing God's will. Whereas Paul, he's on this ship because he actually wants to do God's will. Jonah, he absolutely did not want to preach to the Gentiles. That was the worst thing ever for Jonah. He'd rather be dead than to preach to Gentiles. But Paul, here he's actually risking his life, and he almost does die so that he can preach to the Gentiles. Paul actually wants to do God's will. He wants to bring the gospel to the Gentiles, so he's sort of an anti-Jonah here. In Jonah's case, instead of throwing cargo overboard, they threw Jonah overboard. and that actually saved them from the storm. And then, in their case, the reason they were going through the storm in Jonah's day is because of Jonah. Because Jonah was guilty, and so the Lord sent the storm to punish Jonah. Here, it's kind of the opposite. These people who are accusing Paul, they're the ones who are guilty, and God is sending the storm maybe as a punishment for punishing his innocent apostle. Maybe. The story doesn't tell us exactly why, the storm was coming upon him. But here, at least we know, he's not being stormed. This storm has not come upon him because Paul is guilty. No, it's the opposite. He is innocent. So Paul is like the anti-Jonah. I think that's really cool to see those connections. In verse 20, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. So keep in mind, they did not have GPS. Okay, they did not even have compasses. The only way that you could navigate during the day was looking at the sun, but it's just totally stormy. The clouds are out. They can't see the sun at all. They have no way of navigating. Okay, and also at night you would use the stars, but again, they can't see the stars either. So what this means is this ship is completely out of their control. It's completely in God's control. Where they end up is going to be completely dependent on the providence of God. And here's an application for us. Even though we are God's servants and trying to do what is right, we may find ourselves in a storm, in utter darkness in our life, feeling completely out of control, and we're just being battered, and we have no idea where we're going to end up and what's going to happen to us, that we might even be in a situation where our life is in jeopardy like Paul's here. And this storm is actually going to last another 11 days that they're going to be going through this. So it's going to be 14 days of dealing with this storm in total. And there's no hope in sight. And sometimes we're going to feel that way in our life, that there's no hope. We're just in this storm and we have no idea where we're going. We have no idea where we're going to end up. And that's when we have to trust in the mercy and the grace of God and in the providence of God to bring us through the storm, to bring us safely out the other side. I may not know where I'm going to end up and where this storm is leading, but God is in control of the ship. God is the one who's going to bring me to the destination that He wants me to be in, even though I have no control over getting to that destination myself. It's a little scary, okay, because it's a reality of life, of what we're going to go through and suffer, even as God's servants, even someone so righteous as Paul, to go through this. But it's also tremendously comforting to know the Lord knows where we're going, even if we don't. The Lord knows where we're going to end up, even if we don't. The key is to stay faithful to Him, continue to trust in the Lord the way Paul does. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 27, verses 21 to 32, and remember, they're in a horrible spot. They have given up hope. They think they're all going to die at this point because they're surrounded by darkness in this storm at night. They can't see the stars. There's no lights on the front of their ship like modern ships today. They have no GPS. They have no compass. Even during the daytime, because of the storm, they can't see the sun, so they don't know what direction they're traveling. They've thrown much of their cargo overboard. They've tried to patch up the ship and fix the leaks, but those are just temporary fixes, and they know eventually they stay out long enough and that ship is going to fall apart. So everybody thinks that they're going to die in this situation. And remember, it's all because they didn't listen to Paul. Paul told them to winter there in Fair Havens on the island of Crete, but they didn't listen and they thought, no, we can go a little bit further. We can get to Phoenix. It didn't happen. And now they're in this horrible spot being driven about. It's interesting, verse 27 says driven about. So they're kind of moving in all kinds of different directions. Now, generally speaking, they are moving westward toward the small island of Malta. Here's a map. And you also see on this map, there's sort of a general idea of where the storm took them during that 14 days period. And you can see it's moving in a general westerly direction, but because of the winds were just so contrary and all over the place, it was not a straight line. It was not a straight shot from the island of Crete to the island of Malta. No, they were driven about, going all over the place, and hence their hopelessness and not knowing what's going to happen to them. Are they going to die? Honestly, this story kind of reminds me of Jesus in the boat with His disciples, when the disciples are all panicking and they're freaking out, thinking that they're going to die, and Jesus is just asleep on the stern, and Jesus is perfectly calm because He knows He controls the storm. He knows His Father is going to provide for him and keep them safe. And there's a little bit of parallelism there with Paul, where Paul is going to stand up and say, hey, the Lord appeared to me. He's he's got this in his control. He's going to bring us safely to Rome. Now, I'm a little hesitant with that parallel because it seems like Paul himself was scared. So he's not a perfect parallel with Jesus, because Paul too, I think, was afraid. And that's why the angel's going to have to comfort him and say, do not be afraid, Paul, just like he has in the past. Okay, but first remember, this all started with them not listening to Paul. So Paul tells them in verse 21, you should have listened to me. Okay, and let me just say, Paul's not being petty there. It's not just like, well, hate to say I told you so, and, should have listened to me. It's sort of like making himself feel better and making sure everybody knows he was right. Right? It's not being childish where he's rubbing it in their faces either. He's not just, sticking it to them and saying, I told you so. See, I told you so. That's not what this is. He's trying to get them to take him seriously. It's kind of like when a child disobeys the parents and faces bad consequences for it, and the parent says to the child, this is why you should have listened to me, right? Because I'm speaking from experience here. I know what I'm talking about. And the reason the parent says that is not to rub their child's nose in it, right, or to just stick it to their child. It's so that their child will realize, hey, maybe mom and dad know what they're talking about. Maybe they have some credibility and I should listen to them in the future. And I think that's what Paul's doing. He's trying to build his credibility so that they will listen to him in the future. And that's important because he's got something to say to them and he really wants them to listen. And we're going to see in today's reading, they actually are ready to listen to Paul now. They are taking Paul a lot more seriously than they had before. And again, from a worldly wisdom perspective, you get why they didn't listen to Paul at first. I mean, he's just a Jewish rabbi. Yeah, maybe he's a Roman citizen. But, Jews are not, seafaring people, okay? What does he know about sailing? Okay, obviously they're going to listen to the pilot and they're going to listen to the owner before they listen to Paul. But remember, Paul had been on 3 missionary journeys. People have calculated that he spent over 3,500 miles at sea on these journeys. So he's got a ton of sailing experience. And again, like I said yesterday, he's been shipwrecked 3 times, which he mentions in 2 Corinthians 11. So he knows what it's like to make poor decisions out at sea. They should have listened to him, but now they're in a much better position to listen to what Paul has to say. Notice verse 21, they're also really starving. They'd gone a long time without food. This is almost 14 days. I don't know, maybe somewhere between 10 and 14 days. They haven't eaten yet. And it's not because they don't have any food on the ship. It's because everybody's been manning their stations. They've just been dealing with emergency situation after emergency situation. If the ship is leaking and it's being tossed back and forth, how are you going to cook? How are you going to prepare a meal in that kind of environment? So everybody's just exhausted. They're starving. They're feeling hopeless, and it's in the midst of this utter despair and darkness that Paul gets up and he becomes a light to the Gentiles. Okay, kind of like what Jesus told him back in chapter 26 when he was referencing his calling by Jesus to become a light to the Gentiles who are in darkness. Here Paul is that light again, and he's telling them in verse 22, take courage, because I know none of you are going to lose your lives. We are going to lose the ship. Okay, so he is honest about that. He says, but all of our lives will be spared because God sent an angel. And I love how he says, it's the God to whom I belong. I love that. Paul knows where he belongs. He knows that's his Father. He's in God's family, the one true God whom I serve, whom I worship, right? And maybe we don't really get much indication of this here, but maybe some of them, like in Jonah's day, were crying out and praying to their own gods, for safety. And Paul, he's getting up and standing up for the one true God. And he's saying the one true God is in control. He says, take courage. He says, do not be afraid because I'm bringing you, Paul, to Caesar. And interestingly, he says in verse 24, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Now, it is possible and very likely that the language implies Paul has been praying for their safety as well. It's not just that Paul is praying for his own safety in this situation. He's even praying for the safety of these people who put him in prison and are bringing him to Rome on false charges. If Paul was selfish and petty and driven by natural human instincts. He might be thinking, kill all these people, but let me live. Okay, spare Luke, spare my companions, Aristarchus, right? But kill all these Gentiles. Paul doesn't have that kind of attitude. He wants everybody to be saved, not just spiritually, okay, but physically as well, because if they die physically at sea, then they're going to die spiritually because they haven't obeyed the gospel. And so this is just a tremendous attitude that Paul has, always seeking other people's salvation, and God grants it to him. He says, yes, I will spare everybody's life on this ship along with yours. And how many times is that true, that this country is spared and places filled with wicked people are spared because of the prayers of the righteous, or because there's just a righteous person in their midst. And because God wants to spare that righteous person, the wicked people around the righteous are also spared in the process. Really, really amazing there to see God's providence, not just for Paul, but even for those around him. He says, keep your courage. I believe, verse 25, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. That is what faith is about. When God tells you something, you believe it's absolutely going to happen the way He says it's going to happen, even when it doesn't look like it at all. They look like there's no hope at all. How in the world am I supposed to get to Rome when I'm lost at sea? We have no idea where we are. We're in complete darkness, no navigational system. How in the world am I supposed to get to Rome on this boat that's about to fall apart and we're all about to die? Paul says, I believe it, because God said it. That is powerful faith. And he says, we're going to run aground on an island, and we'll get there in tomorrow's reading. It'll be that island of Malta. But now, verse 27, when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. So, interesting language there by calling it the Adriatic Sea, because when you look on a map, the Adriatic Sea is labeled as being between Italy and Macedonia, up a lot farther north. But really, in the first century world, what we're labeling the Adriatic Sea today on our maps was more commonly known as the Gulf of Adria, up there between Italy and Macedonia. That was like an Adriatic Gulf, not the sea. The Sea of Adria was a way of referring to the very center of the Mediterranean Sea, which is where they are. So that's the reason for that different language. Adriatic Sea is a perfectly accurate way of describing where they are right now in the Mediterranean, in the central part of the Mediterranean Sea. And the sailors, they surmise that they were approaching some land. Now, probably the way that they surmised that was hearing the breakers on either on the rocks, okay, or up against the land. Because, again, they can't really see, but you can hear, if you're getting close to shore, if you can hear waves breaking, again, either against rocks or against the sea. I was trying to look in the text. I don't think it says that specifically, but typically that's how it would work. It's not like they just had a premonition and they just had a sense that we're coming near shore. No, they probably could hear those waves breaking, so they start to take soundings to figure out how deep they are. And this would tell them how close they are to the shore. To take a sounding, they would take a rope and they would tie knots 6 feet apart on the rope. And a fathom originally was the distance between, and I can't do it on the video because my hands will be out of the shot, but the distance between from fingertip to fingertip at a full span. So again, about 6 feet, and they would put those knots along the rope, and then they would put a weight at the end of the rope, and they'd lower that weighted rope down to the bottom. And whenever the rope hit the bottom, they would pull the rope back up and see how many knots in the rope were wet. And that would tell them the distance and the length to the bottom. And so here, 20 fathoms is 20 times 6 feet, which is 120 feet. Well, then they waited a little bit further as they were sailing along further west. They took another sounding, and it was 90 feet. So they can tell from 120 to 90 that the ground is getting more and more shallow, and they are approaching land. But the problem is, it's still nighttime. They can't see where they're going. They don't know if they're going to run up on some rocks and just absolutely shatter the ship. And so they throw 4 anchors from the back of the boat to try to keep the boat still until daybreak. Because once it's daytime, yeah, they'll still have cloud cover, but at least they can see out and they can see if we're going to run up on any rocks, and maybe, hey, maybe there's a port nearby and they can sort of navigate their way around the rocks or whatever and get safely to the shore. But there's another problem, because the sailors, they don't want to wait until daybreak. They try to save themselves. They try to abandon ship, and they try to take that little dinghy, that little, lifeboat, and escape on that boat in the middle of the night, and thus abandoning all the other prisoners on board to death. Maybe that was their reasoning. Maybe they thought, look, our lives are more valuable than these prisoners, so we need to get out of here while we still can and forget these guys. And Paul is onto their program. They're pretending like, oh, we're just going to take the boat, to bring some anchors out to the front of the ship, and we want to sort of reach the anchors out as far away from the ship as possible. So we're going to row the boat out with the anchor, and that way we can drop the anchor really far, and that will make the boat more secure. And Paul, again, he's no dummy. He knows about sailing. He realizes that's not necessary. You don't have to do that. And he's sort of on to their plan. Maybe God, maybe the Holy Spirit helped him know also what they were up to. But Paul tells them, well, he goes straight to the centurion, Julius, who is in charge of the ship. He's the authority on this ship. And so he tells the centurion, look, unless these guys remain, none of us are going to be saved. We're all going to be lost. And, there's some practicality to that. Those are the sailors. Those are the ones who know how to actually navigate and run the ship. And so if they leave, well, then what's going to happen the next day? How are they going to navigate safely to shore? They're going to be stranded at sea. And you got to remember, in that day, nobody knew how to swim. Okay, I mean, we look at it as so common, and we're taking our kids to the YMCA, and you're just learning to swim from an early age. But most people, they remember the sea represented death. Okay, they're not having days at the beach. They didn't go and just go boogie boarding and go swimming in the ocean for fun. Like, no, you stay away from the ocean. The ocean is a horrible place. Nobody knows how to swim. So if the sailors leave, then yeah, the ship is just sitting there with nobody who knows how to navigate it. And so Paul says, yeah, if they leave, we're all dead. And so the soldiers, they end up cutting away the ropes of the ship's boat, and they let it fall away. So Julius, he's much more in a position ready to listen to Paul. Okay, and then they even listen to the centurion because I think Julius is listening to Paul, and they have respect for Paul too now. So they cut the ship away, which I don't know if that was what Paul had in mind. Maybe that's dangerous because now we don't have our lifeboat anymore. But I really like that attitude, and this is sort of going to be our application for today. Sometimes you just got to cut off the temptation, right? It was kind of an extreme reaction, and again, I'm not sure that's what Paul was wanting them to do, but hey, I appreciate that because Julius knows, look, if we leave this lifeboat here, then maybe somebody will try to escape again. Maybe once, if we all fall asleep or something, maybe a group of people will try to get off in the lifeboat and escape. And so they said, let's just cut off the temptation. Let's just remove it completely. And that way the temptation isn't even around. And that's so helpful for our own lives. Sometimes, we're trying to overcome sin, but we leave escape routes around us. And I don't mean escape routes from sin. I mean escape routes to actually go commit the sin. So it's like, I'm trying to overcome alcoholism, but it's like, hey, I still got some beers in the fridge. It's almost like just in case, right? Just in case life gets too hard, well then then I've got the beer there, right? And we sort of keep these temptations around when we should just cut it out of our lives completely. That will then allow us to focus more on Jesus, to be all in on Him. When we don't have an escape plan to go back to our old way of life, there's only one way, and that's forward with Jesus. It reminds me of Hernan Cortez. He was a Spanish conquistador, and he led his men in battle against the Mayans. And they pulled up in their little boats on shore to go attack the Mayans, and he realized, here's what we need to do. Because the Mayans had never been defeated. This was like an extremely, almost impossible task that they were facing. And so Cortez knew he needed to do something drastic. And so he told his men to burn their boats, set the boats on fire. And of course that sounded crazy to the men, but Cortez's point was, without our boats, there's no retreat. There's no looking back. There's no escape. The only way is forward to conquer the Mayans. The only way we're going to get to go home is if we are on the ships of our enemies, is if we conquer the Mayans and we take their ships for ourselves. If you want to go home, that's the only way. And sometimes we need that attitude as Christians. We got to burn the boats behind us of our old life and just press forward and say, look, there's no turning back now. I'm following Jesus. And that's what the apostles tell us to do. And I like this idea here that God's grace, in His grace, He says, I'm saving this ship. Okay, but there's a condition to God's grace. We've got to cut the ship. We've got to cut this lifeboat off, right? If we're going to actually be saved according to God's grace. Same thing with us. We're saved by God's grace, but we still got to be committed to Him. We still have to listen to what He tells us to do, to stay in the boat, like Paul says to the men there, if we want to be saved. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're finishing up Acts 27, verse 33 through 44. You got to imagine tensions on the ship are pretty high at this point. It is true they had a little bit of hope because Paul said, look, an angel appeared to me. He said, we're all going to survive. We'll be fine. You know, the ship is not going to be fine, but we're going to be fine. And they've heard that land is nearby. So there is a little bit of hope there. But then, you know, there's a damper put on their hope because the sailors tried to abandon ship and basically leave everybody else to die and to drown at sea. So you got to imagine, even though Paul stopped that from happening and the centurion Julius, you know, he cut the ropes off the lifeboat, so now nobody else can escape. You got to imagine people aren't really happy with the sailors there. I mean, these sailors just basically tried to kill them and just abandon them at sea. So tensions are high from that. Also, it's been 14 days and people haven't eaten. And when you don't have food, you're much more irritable. You're much more easily set off. And not to mention the fact that maybe some of them have been seasick as well. I mean, 14 days of being tattered back and forth. I mean, you got certainly some people would have been seasick, and that might also be another reason why they hadn't eaten. Number one, they hadn't eaten because they've been manning their stations and dealing with emergency after emergency in this storm, but also if they were seasick, they wouldn't have felt like eating either. And so it's nighttime still, and Paul is encouraging them to eat. Please take strength. You've got to eat something because when daylight comes, you need your strength to bring us the rest of the way to shore, to safety with the ship. And so he tells them in verse 34, take some food, for this is for your preservation. So here's the Apostle Paul telling people what to do to be saved again. Earlier in yesterday's reading, he said, if you want to be saved, you got to stay in the boat. So there's this idea of God's grace is gracious. It's merciful, but it doesn't mean we just sit back and do nothing. God's grace has conditions. You will be saved, okay, but you have to respond and you have to do what God says. You got to do what His apostles say, and that is stay in the boat. And in this case, you got to eat something if you want to be saved. And this, of course, is not spiritual salvation, it's physical salvation, but you sort of get the point. You see that connection between salvation, trusting in an apostle for your salvation, and that's what they're doing here. And Paul, interestingly, he says to them something similar that Jesus said to His disciples when He said, not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Jesus said that to His disciples, telling them not to fear, back in Matthew chapter 10, not to fear man. God will protect you because the hairs of your head are all numbered. And then having said this, He takes bread, He gives thanks to God, right? He's not ashamed to own God. Among these pagans, He prays right in front of them. It's such a great example of standing up for God, knowing whom you believe, not being ashamed to pray in front of all these people to the one true God. And then He breaks the bread and He begins to eat, and all of them are encouraged by this prayer. They're encouraged by the strength that they're getting from this meal. They're probably encouraged by, some of the unity that they might experience from this meal, where now they're not at each other's throats anymore. Now they can just sort of relax and eat. And this is not the Lord's Supper, of course. Paul, he's eating with a bunch of pagans. Yeah, Luke was there, Aristarchus was there, but this isn't the Lord's Supper, this is a regular meal. But I do see a parallel here with the Lord's Supper because Luke is always drawing parallels between Jesus and Paul, because Paul is continuing the work of Jesus on the earth. And so, for instance, you see the fact that Jesus, like Paul, was telling people what to do to be saved. And those that listened to Jesus became His disciples. And it's almost like those who listened to Paul and stayed in the ship to be saved from yesterday's reading, it's almost like they have become his disciples now. And now they continue to listen to Paul when he tells them what else to do to be saved, which is to take food. They're listening to Paul. They're following Paul's instructions, just like Jesus' disciples followed his. And you've got Paul saying, this thing about the hair on your head to his disciples, right? Just like Jesus said that to his disciples. And then now it's almost like Jesus, when he institutes this Lord's Supper, he does so to encourage his disciples and to promote unity among the disciples. And now Paul, he's leading and initiating this meal. He's breaking the bread. He's giving it out, kind of like Jesus did with the Lord's Supper. He's praying about this bread, blessing this bread. And this meal is a way to encourage Paul's disciples, right? Those who have listened to Paul for salvation on the ship. And it's to promote unity between them because they've got this tension going on between the prisoners and the sailors, and this meal is bringing people together. So I just think that's a really neat thing to notice those parallels that Luke might be pointing us toward. Now, in verse 37, he mentions the number of people are 276 people. And you might wonder, why does he put it here? Why wouldn't he put that detail, earlier in the story? Probably it's because they had to count the people to divide the food. They needed to split the food up 276 ways so everybody would have enough. And that's why Luke probably includes that detail here when it's talking about them eating together. Now, after they'd taken their food, verse 38, they realized we've got to get rid of more of the food. The extra food that's on the ship, we've got to get rid of this. It's still weighing us down. We need the ship to be as light as possible if we're going to, have smooth sailing for the rest of the way here, and the wind will be able to drive us, to the land much easier. And so when day came, they couldn't recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. Usually on your way to Rome, you probably wouldn't stop at Malta, so this land is a little foreign to most of them. If you did stop at Malta, it probably would have been on a different part of the island, maybe more of the eastern side of the island. But this is more of like a foreign place to them. They don't really recognize it, but they do see a bay and they see a beach. They see sand on the shore there, and they say, look, we can just drive the ship right up onto the shore. And that's their plan. So they cast off the anchors. They don't need the anchors anymore because the anchors were obviously keeping them still. But also, if they pulled the anchors back onto the ship, well, that would just weigh down the ship. They don't want more weight, so they just get rid of the anchors at this point, and they drop the rudders down back into the water so that the rudders can use that to steer. And now they've got the foresail up front so that the wind can sort of drive them to shore. But there's a problem. They strike a reef, and a reef can be either made of rock or made of sand. And this particular reef would have been made of sand where the two seas meet. Let's talk about location here. We're not 100% sure where this happened, but we're pretty close to sure. Those that have researched all of this, they believe that this is a particular location which is now known in our modern day as St. Paul's Bay. You can actually go and visit this. Here's a picture of St. Paul's Bay. Now, a little bit farther out from St. Paul's Bay, off the island of Malta, is a tiny island of Salmonetta. And this tiny island is now known today as St. Paul's Island. And you can actually visit that island, and there's a statue of Paul that was erected in 1844. You can go see that statue there on St. Paul's Island, and you'll notice that in between the island of Malta and this little island, St. Paul's Island of Salmonetta, there's a little channel, a narrow channel. It's about 100 feet wide. And when that water flows through that channel and meets the water of St. Paul's Bay, it gives the appearance of two different seas meeting together. And that's part of what is believed to have formed this sandbar. And people say today that sandbar is still there in that same location. Though today that sandbar is deeper. It's like 39 feet deep today. But that's because of all of the water erosion over time. But in Paul's day, it's calculated that that sandbar was 13 feet deep. So you can see why their ship ran aground on that sandbar, and that's why it's called St. Paul's Island, because it's that sandbar was right up against this particular island, and that sandbar was about a quarter mile away from St. Paul's Bay. So their ship gets wrecked, and in order to actually, swim to safety, they're going to have to swim like a quarter mile to get to the bay, because it's kind of hard to get to the island because it's made of just like really steep rocks. So St. Paul's Island, Isle of Salmonetta, that's not really a good place for them. They've got to swim to the beach area. So this is still a really precarious spot, because now the front of the ship is stuck in the mud. And now that the front of the ship is stuck, the prow is basically the front part of the ship that is above water. Okay, the bow of the ship is the front part. The prow of the ship is the front part that was above the water. And it's saying, like, even that gets stuck in this giant sandbar. And so now I don't picture it like the whole front of the ship is covered, but at least a part of the ship that was out of the water also gets stuck in the mud. So the point is, they're stuck really deep. This isn't just like the sand is sort of scraping across the bottom. It's the sand has come around to the very front of the ship and just sort of mounded up in a pile as the ship has just run straight into this. And what that means is the front part is stuck and the back part is still getting hit by waves. We don't know the intensity of the storm at this point. It could be that probably the majority of the storm has passed, but still, the waves are really choppy, and there's no, from a physics standpoint, there's just no give on the ship. Normally if the waves hit the ship, there's a little bit of give and the ship will rock back and forth. But if the ship is literally stuck in place, that means all the force from those waves is being taken on by that ship, and the ship is being torn to pieces by the waves. So this is a really, really precarious spot. And now the soldiers realize, we've got to abandon ship, right? We're toast here. And they realize, though, that might be a problem, because some of the prisoners may escape if they all abandon ship together. And if a Roman prisoner escaped, well, then you as the guard would face whatever punishment that prisoner was facing. So it was a serious offense for a Roman soldier to allow a prisoner to escape. So they realized, we've got to actually kill these prisoners. That's the only solution here. Let's kill all the prisoners so that, none of them will escape and we won't get in any trouble. And so now you've got, two more obstacles in the way of Jesus's promises coming true. Because now it's like, okay, now we thought that they were going to be safe. We thought that they were all going to live, but now the ship is stuck, and now they might all drown. And then the soldiers want to kill the prisoners, and guess who's a prisoner? Paul is. So Paul might be killed by one of these prisoners. So here's two more threats to Paul's safety, two more threats to Jesus' promise of bringing Paul safely to Rome not coming true. And yet Jesus still provides the centurion Julius. He's not going along with that plan. He wants Paul brought safely. He has respect for Paul. Paul has, saved his life already, okay, and given him hope and, prayed to his God, and here's another example, in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, where a Roman centurion is just so level-headed. And you got these centurions that are much more likely to have faith in God than the Jews or than other pagans even. A lot of centurions just are pictured as very level-headed. And he has an idea. Look, those of us who can swim, which again, most people in the ancient world couldn't swim, but those of us soldiers who can swim, let's just swim on ahead of everybody else. Let's get to the shore ourselves first. And then the prisoners come, and whoever can swim, that's fine. We'll be able, from the shore of St. Paul's Bay, right, we'll be able to watch them as they come into shore. And if they try anything funny and they try to escape, we'll be able to catch them. And everybody else who can't swim, they'll just have to float on planks and, various items from the ship. And that way, no prisoners will escape. It'll just be, sort of a win-win. And so that plan works. Verse 44, so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Remember when Paul said back in verse 25 in yesterday's reading, I believe that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. It turns out exactly as Paul was told. The ship was lost. The ship was destroyed, but everybody on the ship survived. And we see some really cool ways that this chapter ties into the major themes of Acts. One, you see, salvation is for everyone, right? It's not just for Paul, who's a Jew, right? It's also for all of these pagans. God spares their life. And it's just a microcosm of what we see in the book of Acts as a whole, that salvation is not just for certain people. It's not just for the special people. It's for everybody. God wants all to be saved. And we also see a major theme in Acts, that God's plans cannot be stopped, cannot be thwarted. The book of Acts is all about Satan trying to stop God's plans from coming to fruition. And here we've got Satan again, hoping and praying that Paul is going to drown at sea and trying to stop God's plan from being carried out. And yet God still protects Paul. Paul is safe. Paul is still going to be on his way to Rome, because that is God's will. And God's will cannot be thwarted by anything or anyone. It's really an amazing thing. And let me finish with this application. As Christians, we ought to be the calmest people in the storm. We ought to be the models for how to handle times of crisis. In those times, we need to be people of prayer. We need to be praying to God, not just for ourselves, but also for the people who are in the crisis with us. We need to keep our wits about us and to be reasonable. I mean, Paul doesn't say, hey, God is with us, so we don't need to eat, and sure, it doesn't matter what you do. No, he's taking precautions, and even though he knows God is with him, he still says, look, we need to eat or we're going to die. Okay, so yeah, God is with us, but he also expects us to use common sense. It's like, yeah, God, I believe God's going to protect me while I'm driving, but he also wants me to put my seatbelt on, right? So, well, one of the ways God protects us is through reasonable decisions in crisis points. And so that's what you see from Paul, a total reliance on God, praying to God for himself and for others, taking reasonable steps toward securing their safety, and then ultimately just trusting that God's will is going to be done, that God is in control. And I know it's different for us because we didn't have an angel appear to us and tell us exactly what was going to happen. I get that. But we do have God's word that assures us God loves us and that he is working all things together for our good, so that in times of crisis, either it will strengthen our character and make us more like Jesus, or if we die in that crisis, even if we don't survive the crisis, we'll get to go meet Jesus. And so either way, we should be the calmest ones in the room, because we, like Paul, are living by faith. Hope that's helpful. Have a great weekend. See you on Monday.